will hosted by Dimac. So Dimac, you need to stay here and welcome your guest. I think your guest is all here right now. Sam, Aki, Tom, and Albert. But Albert is not here. Is Michael. Michael is from LayerTwo Labs. Yeah. Okay.
Hello. Hi.
So, hello. So Dimac, you can start your panel, I think.
All right. So we're going to be discussing sovereignty today, but before we get started with the questions, why don't we do a round of introductions with each of the guests? We'll just go in the order of the profile pictures on the on the cover card. So Sam, why don't you give us a brief introduction?
Sure. Hi. I'm Sam. I founded the Arweave protocol, and now I run Forward Research, which is one of the institutions in the Arweave ecosystem pushing for the network's adoption.
Aki, go ahead.
Yeah, Aki Balo co-founded DLC Link. We are implementing an MIT invention called discrete log contracts, DLCs, that enable Bitcoin to be trustlessly used in Ethereum protocols, and we are launching a non-custodial wrapped Bitcoin token called DLC BTC in a few months.
Very cool. Tom, why don't you introduce yourself?
Everyone, my name's Tom Wilson. I'm a founder in residence at Forward Research, a venture studio that's in the Arweave ecosystem. And I'm also the core developer of the stamp protocol, which is the universal like in the Arweave network.
And Albert,
Hi.
Please introduce yourself. Hi.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I'm Albert, founder of the Bitcoin Startup Lab, and we currently are the largest pre-accelerator on Bitcoin now. We have over 100 mentors, and we're also the creators of the Bitcoin Olympics Hackathon, which became the largest Bitcoin hackathon ever in terms of technologies under one hackathon, 15 different Bitcoin technologies. Thank you.
Sure. Why don't we kick it off with you, Albert? Today we're discussing sovereignty in the Web3 era, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, particularly in how you would define those terms. When you think of Web3, what do you think of? And when you think of sovereignty, what do you think of? And how much of a role does one play in the other?
Can you help me define what you mean by sovereignty before I get into that?
Like personal sovereignty.
Right. Okay. So personally, I like I'm fairly new to Web3, and I learned a lot of my Web3 from A16Z, and I do agree with their one-line definition of Web3, which I believe is the user-owned internet.
Okay.
Yeah,
and go ahead.
Go ahead. No, that was my.
That was, yeah. So user-owned, this idea of empowering individuals, a version of the web that empowers individuals, that seems to have a sort of a natural overlap with this concept of personal sovereignty. Maybe Aki, would you care to weigh in on the value or the importance, or maybe even a definition of personal sovereignty?
Yeah, I guess the way I would say it is the way that the internet evolved with Web 1, like just web pages in Google search, it was very one-directional. Web 2 was bi-directional, where you could interact with each other and so on. But that game was still, the Web 1 and Web 2 game was fully locked up in the protocols. So if you, for example, previous to this, I ran an AI marketing optimization company for 8 years that I founded. And the if you're doing Facebook marketing, let's say, then all of the assets you create, all of your work ends up being owned and monetized by Facebook, and all of your data also ends up being owned and monetized by Facebook. Basically, they might give you a copy, but it all adds to Facebook's sort of value as sort of and then they can really do whatever they want, and there's no transparency. And that's just your digital profile. That's just use your identity, which is already a big deal. And then you, of course, they track you across websites, and the web has evolved that way. But then even worse, when it comes to your money, your money is issued by different governments with different, agendas and different, constituents. And then you take that money, and you put it into a bank that is, although regulated, and you can inspect the regulations, but you cannot inspect the workings of the bank. And so that's, okay, except for every 10 years or so, banks seem to fail for kind of unexplained reasons, because they made bad loans or they made some other decisions. And so, we're living in a kind of an age where most of the things we do are not owned by us, and we're kind of like a player in a game that we cannot influence. And to me, Web3 on those various different layers returns that to the user. You can actually own your asset and hold the asset, and it's yours, and it cannot be censored, it cannot be taken away. That's the promise of Bitcoin as an asset. These different DeFi and various blockchains and protocols. You can inspect the code. You can see, like what the issues are. I mean, it's all extremely transparent. It's open finance. And if you take a loan, for example, or you do some sort of finance, you can actually see that on an order book or on a, ledger in a pool or somewhere, and you can trace it. And so you have traceability, and that also breeds accountability, so that, if you put your money somewhere, you don't have to be afraid that some malignant actor or somebody acting either in bad faith or just mishandling it is going to, give your money out on a loan that then fails, and you end up, footing the bill. And I think that's like on different layers, the vision that we're all trying to, to get to.
Yeah. So what I would extract from that is that sovereignty is really about taking custody or ownership, and not having to depend on other parties for that. Sam, that's something that's critical to decentralized systems, and specifically Arweave. Maybe you could weigh in.
Yeah, so I think sovereignty in its core sense is about rights. What you are allowed to do, what you are not allowed to do on your own initiative without asking for permission. And so part of that is ownership. But I would say that's actually a relatively small corner in the long run. It is where crypto has focused in the early years. But my hunch is that essentially where this all goes, well, what does a blockchain allow you to do fundamentally? It allows you to create systems that enforce that users have rights that can't be taken away from them. So you can render services via the internet in one form or another, from money to exchanges to the storage of data, in which the business model of those services is made transparent and immutable, subsequently rendering rights to the users. And so, yes, I think that ownership can be part of this, but it's definitely not the whole. And so when we think about sovereignty in the real world, well, we think fundamentally you have a right to free speech in America. That's the First Amendment. And then a bunch of other subsequent rights. You get to property ownership quite far down the list, actually. And I would also kind of argue that, okay, and this is, I'm curious to hear what other people think about this, because I've never quite been convinced that ownership is the core of Web3 for the following reason. Well, I can go out and buy a share in Amazon, actually, and I have been able to since 2003, I think was the IPO, somewhere around that time. Maybe even before, right? No, 99. And the same with Google. I could buy shares in Google. I could buy shares in Meta while it was, when it was Facebook, when it was just one product. I could buy shares in Twitter. So I could actually become an owner of essentially most of the Web2 services that matter to me for a long time. But that's not really the thing that I think matters to end users. What matters is, in the case of Arweave, okay, if there's a decentralized version of Twitter on top of Arweave, you can't be censored. It doesn't matter how many tokens or shares or anything I own, it's that you actually have immutable rights and subsequently sovereignty on that platform. I can't take your identity away from you. You have the keys, right? And so when I think about Web3, that's, I guess, where my mind goes. Although I can certainly appreciate that ownership is a part of it. And we've been doing a lot of work in the Arweave ecosystem around how to associate real world rights with on-chain tokens, in particular as it relates to content. So when you upload a video, for example, you can put what we call universal data license on top of it, and then you can say, okay, anyone can access my video, but if you want to use it for commercial purposes, you have to distribute a royalty in the following fashion. And then you can trade access to that royalty. So you have a real world, legally enforceable right that's associated with that token. I think that's like a strong form of ownership in cyberspace. But I think that's only the start of this.
I'd like to thank you for that, Sam. So yes, it's like uncensored, but I'd like to speak on the ownership part. I'm originally from the Silicon Valley. Before we started the Bitcoin Startup Lab, and this is going to go right into the ownership. Like there's a real life example of what happened to me about 2 years ago, right? The reason why, okay, so I moved to Shanghai, China in 2001. And in the beginning, full disclosure, guys, I was a naysayer for Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. I had to eat my words about 2 years ago because at that time we had already done 21 cohorts, pre-accelerated cohorts in China, making us the longest running pre-accelerator in all of China. As a result, we had equity in many companies. The policies started coming down, and some of the best performing companies were in sectors that the government deemed expats cannot own equity anymore. I was forced to give up my shares. I was forced to give up my ownership in those companies. If my wife wasn't Chinese, I would have lost all of those shares. So I do believe the ownership part is super, super important. And that's why from a naysayer getting stomped on by a central authority, that's when my eyes opened to Bitcoin and decentralization and user-owned internet. Right before, I thought it was just like, yeah, this is not going to work. But you know, it may not work. But I'm a believer now, and we're behind this 100% to make it work.
I'll give you a chance to respond, Sam. But I also I was remit in my host duties. I failed to introduce one of our guests today. So Mike Young, I'd like to invite you to join the conversation and give a brief introduction.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I'm Mike. I'm an angel investor in LayerTwo Labs. I've been in Bitcoin since 2011. I've done many things in the industry, and now I'm LayerTwo Labs head person here in Asia and Hong Kong. So good to be on. Yeah.
Great to have you. Yeah, so what I would extract from Albert and Sam, what you both said, I heard you both saying that ownership is important. And also, I think Sam was pointing out a very important thing about sovereignty is that it's not just the ownership, it's the systems, or it's the properties or the attributes of the entire system. So censorship resistance is a property of the entire system. Even in finance, to use your example, Sam, you can of course own shares in a company, but if you want to trade, there's a whole system of middlemen that sort of will front run your opportunity. But with sovereignty and with decentralized systems, it's a much more transparent system, and there's rights and powers and that fall out for individuals from those systems. Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, so I think that's a pretty good encapsulation of what I'm trying to say. Like, sovereignty is this much wider basket of which ownership is part of that basket, but it's not the whole thing. I think, yeah, definitely in the case of Bitcoin, yeah, like that gives you real sovereignty and real ownership in a way that is not there are very few other things that are really bearer assets. You have the bar of gold in your hand. It's kind of a bearer asset, but like it's pretty hard to end up with something like that. Say you own a house. Well, your name is on the deed, right? But actually there are occasionally like disputes about who owns houses and the likes. So it's very hard to have real bearer assets, whereas Bitcoin definitely is one of those. I think where that line gets a little bit blurry, what I was trying to point out was kind of in Web3, in the scare quotes kind of like version of that world, where essentially you have tokens that are associated with the activities of a relatively centralized group of people, right? Which realistically is unfortunately a lot of what Web3 is like in practice. Then I don't personally see how that's much different than owning equity, because the government could come and they could censor that group of people, and that has even in the US that has happened, right? There was called Azuki DAO, something like this. I think it began with a B. Anyway, yeah, the US government essentially came along and to make a very long story simple, censored that operation. And so you could have tokens that are associated with that all you like, but it doesn't really matter because the activities were terminated. That stands in contrast to other things that are more protocolized, like Arweave. Doesn't matter. You can come along. You can. I was about to say something. The whole core team that built Arweave could die in a plane crash, and it wouldn't matter. The network would still run. I only represent one of the many organizations that now push the adoption of the system, like PermaDAO, for example, that put together this whole event. And so there is real decentralization there. You buy ownership in the Arweave protocol, and you're getting access to something that is much closer to Bitcoin. But there's definitely a spectrum between that and kind of Web3 DAOs and Web3 startups, if that makes sense, which I don't think are so censorship resistant because they have sort of high dependence on traditional world structures, if that makes sense. Like they have to organize in the real world to achieve things, and you're buying into the productive output of that group of people that can themselves be censored. Anyway, this is an interesting digression, but yes, I think the core point was sovereignty is a big box, ownership is part of that box.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think I'm in alignment with you on that. Tom, and then Mike, would you care to chip in on the role of sovereignty, or perhaps this, definition of where sovereignty lives within Web3 as part of this discussion?
Yeah, I totally agree with Albert and Sam. The only thing that I would probably reiterate for me, especially with the permaweb as part of the Web3, is the ability to interact online without relying on centralized authorities or platforms. So I do think that is a big differentiator. You don't have to, you can rely on centralized authorities, but having that ability just empowers individuals to make decisions about their digital lives on their grounds. So everything that everybody else says, but I think it's very important that you have that right, that digital right to interact without centralized authorities, and that's still a problem that's being solved, but I feel like we're in that mission to get that right.
Yeah, that's super powerful. In the next version of the web, being built on infrastructure that's not centralized and doesn't have a profit motive. In fact, it's actually sort of competing away any sort of margins in order to offer this substrate for the web to be built on is a super powerful concept. Mike, welcome to the conversation.
Yeah, I think sovereignty in the digital space is very important. But I agree with what was said before. It's important to give people the choice. Just like if you remember watching The Matrix, like some people are just happily living in a digital world. Not everybody's ready for the red pill. So, in a really practical sense, maybe for the mass majority of people, their whole lives is the spectrum, right? They have parts of their lives. They're very self-sovereign, secretive, decentralized, and anonymous. There's other part of the life that is open, public, part of some collective. And I would just say that they don't mind the centralization. They don't mind someone having central control. That's just how society works. Like I think as the internet continues to evolve, more and more self-sovereign technology will exist, and overall people will utilize it. And it's important that we have technology that can be used by both individuals, corporate entities, governments, the whole spectrum that accommodates for everybody's unique need. Yeah, like, but I still think just most people are still at this point in time not ready for full self-sovereignty, I think. And we'll get there. Maybe I'll take a few more FTX and more knowledge and awareness of how to protect your self-sovereignty, your self-rights, including ownership of digital assets, true ownership of your own digital assets. And having those digital assets be on the right type of infrastructure for people to, like the whole industry needs actually more ease of use so that people are more able to take advantage of self-sovereign technologies. Yeah, sorry, it's a little bit late here, so sorry my answer was like a little bit here and there, but that's general just my comment. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. There is some connotation with these terms. Self-sovereignty, when you think about it, really it's that thing that allows you to take control or to have authority over your own actions, your own rights as an individual. But typically, the way that is implemented from a technology standpoint is through the use of public-private key cryptography, which means people are holding keys and they're using that. That's the thing that's the math, if you would, that gives them sovereignty. On the sort of other end of that spectrum, we have terms like Web3, which are really, I think, a reach towards, and this is my definition, and I'm open to hearing other definitions, but making a web that's built on the rights of decentralization and cryptography, but making it as accessible and easy to use as previous versions of the web. And so there's sort of, Mike, you sort of brought this up, there's an implicit tension there, where it's like sovereignty and individual rights are this property of blockchains and decentralized systems and things like public-private key cryptography. But on the other hand, to sort of have this new version of the web, it needs to reach out and include broad audiences that maybe aren't ready. So I guess my question would, aren't ready for that level of technical sophistication. So what is the approach, the way forward that you see here, and the role of personal sovereignty as the web evolves? Do we abstract away the sort of technical parts that are so explicitly linked to personal sovereignty in order to embrace Web3, or do we build Web3 on the fundamental building block or premise of personal sovereignty? Sam, you look like you're thinking something.
Yeah, this is definitely interesting. The thing that always comes to mind for me is, and I think has been the kind of Achilles heel of crypto, and I'm not sure I really drive a distinction between crypto and Web3, really, because I think that most of Web3 so far has been on the finance side, which I would traditionally say is kind of crypto. At least when I got into crypto, like 2012 or something, that was what people meant by it. It was like Bitcoin was also part of crypto. I put it all in that category. The Achilles heel has always been this. There's a real tension here, and then also a tension created by incentives for expediency, basically trading off real decentralization and these things that really give sovereignty with, well, actually making it easy to use and also shipping it to users with the current state of technology, and B, quickly, right? And so in a lot of early Web3 stuff, let's take NFTs as an example. You had very weak forms of ownership with a lot of those. The one that sticks in my mind is during the bull market in NFTs, Lollapalooza issued some commemorative NFT tokens, I think in 2021. And these were stored on Amazon S3, issued by FTX. And then FTX went bust. And so those tokens essentially just point to like the 404 when you try and access them now. People bought those for like $20,000 each or something. Yeah, so I don't really feel like you had any strong sense of ownership there or sovereignty. So that was kind of expedience killed the cat. And we have the same problem on the cryptography side. It's funny because if you think, well, what's the root of all of this? We call it crypto. What is crypto short for? Cryptography. And so if we don't have the keys, which are the essence of cryptography, we can't, like, we go nowhere. And so there's this real tension between like making it easy for end users to access without, without the dragon eating its tail. That's always the thing that comes to mind. Can we deliver that experience to users without also making it so that they lose the thing that was supposed to make the thing great in the first place? And it's definitely a battle that it's not obvious we've won yet. Although there is a great effort going into this. I think some of the new wallet experiences that people are creating are pretty good. Ideas around like, sharing key shards, some of those key shards being held by the user, some being held in centralized locations one way or another, or cloud hosted hardware security modules, that type of thing. It's not the worst on-ramp, but we just have to be careful in the way that we communicate this to people. One final thought, I think, is that sovereignty is inherently dangerous, right? Like when we actually think about sovereign rights, free speech is not a joke. It's not like a trivial thing. You take trade-offs when you give people free speech as a society. Like you let them say things that could cause chaos, to put it mildly. And what's the second right provided by the Constitution in the US? The right to bear arms. Talk about dangerous. Like sovereignty is not a joke, it's not a toy. The right to bear arms is literally the ability to fire weapons at each other. Like does it get more extreme than that? So I don't think that sovereignty is, but I also take your point that Web3 is kind of the application of all of these cryptographic principles about sovereignty and trying to make them easy for people to use and hopefully relatively safe. And I think there's a fundamental contention in there we're not at the bottom of yet. That was what I was thinking when you said it looked like I was thinking something.
Absolutely. Having individual rights, having sovereignty, taking responsibility for those things, one doesn't come without the other. The power that is granted also comes with responsibility. And like anything powerful, it has an upside and also a positive use and a negative use. And so there is this interesting tension with Web3 where there's an effort to decrease the friction. And one of the ways you decrease friction is not ask users to take as much as responsibility right out of the gate, which is what sovereignty asks you to do, to take this power into your own hands. So maybe Aki and then Albert, I'll get you guys to weigh on this. What is the role? We've been talking about sovereignty and to some extent we boiled that down to the idea of having users managing their own keys and taking responsibility. How much of a role does that play in Web3 and also in your businesses when you're in the work that you're doing? Are you leaning into this concept of having users holding keys, or are you making efforts to abstract that away to, I guess, lower the friction? Aki, go ahead.
Yeah, and this it's a nice transition from the last question too. It's like Web3 to me is making cryptography sexy because I want to distinguish between the value or the goal and the current technical implementation or the current technical user experience of something. While we were talking, we're thinking, well, with the internet, when the internet launched, first with DARP in the 70s, and then like you had GeoCities web pages in the 90s, and what it is today and what it will be 80 years from now, or 200 years from now, the goal and kind of the technical experience are two different things. For example, with iPhone, you can unlock it with your face, and probably Android, of course. And so that stuff makes it easy to use. So even though usability can be a barrier, of course, when it's clunky, but the goal is still worth doing and still worth making progress towards. For us, how that works with us, or kind of the decisions our team made to do what we're doing, it's very straightforward. We're building on the thesis that Bitcoin is this decentralized bearer asset, and that it is operated by a network of miners, that it's a proof of work chain, which has inherent obviously pros and cons, but we think benefits to safeguarding one's assets compared to proof of stake and so on. So we believe that building on Bitcoin makes sense, long story short. But if you have Bitcoin, the only ways to use it in any kind of financial application, lend, borrow, earning yield, investment, etc., all of those involve some level of centralization, either by just regular CeFi, Celsius, and so on, or bridges where you're basically pooling Bitcoin in different pools, and then if the network is hacked, that Bitcoin can be stolen. And so we're building a way, kind of what we call a theft-proof bridge, but a way for Bitcoin to be used on other chains, starting with Ethereum as the second most decentralized chain, and then protocols on there. So basically being able to use your Bitcoin in Ethereum and DeFi to earn a yield, or to generate a return while you're holding it through generations. So very, very simple. We took this position because Bitcoin and ETH just seem to be the two most decentralized options. And anyway, that kind of delivers, and we're hoping to do that with a very clean user experience, like a one-click interface.
So in that solution, do holders of Bitcoin put their Bitcoin at risk to participate?
I cannot say no, because anytime you do something, there is risk, but the risk with what we're, of course, logically speaking, but what we are implementing is this DLC, this invention out of MIT that lets you lock Bitcoin in 2 of 2 multisig, where you hold one of the keys. And unlike other kind of current Bitcoin solutions, usually when you lock into something like that, there are 3 keys and the company, owns a 3rd key. We don't have that. So we don't hold a key to your Bitcoin. We cannot take the Bitcoin. You're not pooling it with us. You're not sending it to us. You're basically locking it in kind of an on-chain escrow that you hold, and the protocol holds the other key for administrative purposes and so on. But essentially in V1 of DLC-BTC, you're actually just locking with yourself. The only address that the Bitcoin can go to is yours, and you're just locking it. So that seems to us, when we learned about DLCs 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago now, that seemed to be the most elegant and simplest way to secure Bitcoin for this purpose.
Oh, very interesting. Albert, go ahead.
Yeah, no, super. I mean, Aki, what you're building is also really important. DLCs, leveraging Bitcoin L1. I think there's definitely a lot of experimentation going on in this area. If you're talking about do we promote having people take care of their own keys? I think it really depends on the situation. Like, I'm oversimplifying this, but let me give 2 examples to illustrate my point. Let's say an American, they have a choice. Choice number A, let's say they have only $100,000 in cash, right? They're going to go to a bank that's FDIC insured up to whatever, above that amount, right? So that's secure in that sense. Do they trust the government more to have that money to back them up, like they built out the Silicon Valley Bank? Or do I keep that $100,000 equivalent in a crypto, Bitcoin, whatever, right? And take ownership of their own keys and run the risk of losing those keys, right? Run the risk of losing those keys. Now, which probability is higher, right? I don't think it's such a black and white question at that point in time, right? Now, same situation, also an American, right? And versus let's say a Bitcoin wallet. Now we're talking about if it was $1 million equivalent value, right? Now you're not completely insured. If the bank goes bust, maybe you don't get bailed out. Now in that case, I would say maybe it makes even more sense to hold Bitcoin or some other thing that could give you that security. Now, let's say it's Argentina, someone from Argentina versus an American. If you have your money in cash in the bank, maybe they'll back you up, but maybe because the inflation is so high, it doesn't even matter what kind of guarantees they give you, right? So I think it really depends, and that's on the individual level. Now, if I was a fund manager, or if I was, if it was a business, for example, does it make sense to have one person to have keys? Maybe it's a multi-sig. Maybe there has to be a solution to guard against that chance of that person either losing the keys or something happening to them, and then you can never recover it, right? So I think the question of ownership of one keys is very interesting. It adds another option to the options we have, but we have to consider the context and go through at least 2 different scenarios, right? To figure out exactly in which cases self-sovereignty or multi-sig sovereignty is clearly the path to go. So I mean,
Interesting.
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no.
So what I just wanted to, or did you have something else to add? An additional thing?
No, I'm just saying, yeah, just in summary, it's just the context. The context it's another tool that gives us more options and perhaps a better solution because we have more choices now.
So to frame this, we have Web3. Its intent is to bring to market the properties of self-sovereignty and decentralization and the attributes that those give to individuals. But what I hear coming out of this discussion here today is that it's actually a range, like full self-sovereignty, full custody comes with like a lot of power and a lot of responsibility, but actually there's a range of interest in the market and not all individuals want that much power or responsibility. So part of Web3 is offering sort of a gradient from those things, like being able to engage in a fully self-sovereign way, but also being able to offer layers of value on top of that through things that are, I guess, takes steps towards greater centralization. They're not completely centralized, but they, have more, they also ask less responsibility of the individuals. And so there's this trade-off between like how much responsibility and how much power you need or want. Tom.
Yeah, well, ultimately what that means is if we have the opportunity to build a decentralized, for example, a financial ecosystem, at the very least, like let's say policymakers don't squash it, at the very least it's another type of competition that could keep the incumbents a lot more honest, right?
That's a fantastic point. A lot of times I've seen in various protocols, and this is true of Arweave as well, having the fully decentralized option allows people to, I guess, build more accessible options, knowing that if there was ever any issue with those options that sort of rely on more traditional Web2 infrastructure to deliver, that you could always fall back and use the decentralized option. And so as anyone building on top of this platform, just knowing that users can actually go directly to the protocol and go around any of these sort of convenience options is something that builds sort of inherent transparency and honesty into these solutions that are built on top of these protocols. Tom, I want to get your input here. What is the role of self-sovereignty, crypto keys for individuals in the greater realm of Web3?
Yeah, so I kind of think of it in a very simple way as well, is as Web2 has grown into these very large companies, that they've also, whether intentional or not, tended to kind of control conversations, kind of introduce centralization. And I feel like there's this ongoing battle of really trying to provide a safer, more effective internet, but as a result of potentially creating restrictions on speech, restrictions on rights. And I think with Web3 is kind of the first step in the promise to have that option for sovereignty, have that option to have free speech online, have that option to have rights to do something without central authority. So I kind of see the permaweb as the next step. So the permaweb on Arweave is kind of taking it a step farther than what I understand as Web3, of really just providing a full stack from end to end of decentralized web services for anyone to use. But I always see it as something that will be a set of options. Like there's always going to be large social media services for people who don't want to maintain their keys and don't want to do that. But for people that do, there should be an option, and we should work to make it as easy as possible for those folks to do that.
Great, thank you. So let's pivot the conversation a little bit. We've talked about Bitcoin and different mechanisms of custody that have this sort of gradient of like full self-custody to the various layers above that have different affordances for users. I'd like to pivot the conversation to talk about a parallel to that, which is data sovereignty. When Bitcoin as a sort of a financial asset is brings sovereignty and the rights, and we've been talking about the larger discussion of what sovereignty means. It's not just ownership; it's been larger. But in terms of data sovereignty, perhaps Sam, I could ask you to sort of compare and contrast what that looks like relative to sort of financial sovereignty.
Well, I think you were right to frame this as you did 2 questions ago, if I'm not mistaken, as essentially, or no, 1 question ago, keys. Keys are the thing that enable sovereignty in cyberspace. And so, yes, like financial sovereignty is a sort of box inside that, but ultimately it's just the playing field that we're discussing is only made available via keys. And actually, I wanted to follow up on something, a Thomism that he did not say here, but is kind of an answer to the last question that I think is really worth at least discussing, which is, I forget how Tom phrased it. This was at the 5-year anniversary of Arweave Mainnet. Tom gave a talk, and one of the things he said was, that it is a privilege to have one's own keys. Like we should be, it's an honor to have that sovereignty, that we shouldn't be so excited to give away. Like it's quite annoying. Yeah, we've got to remember these sets of words, or keep safe a set of 12 words, 24 words somewhere. Okay, but what you get from that is non-trivial. It's really powerful. It is your voice. It's literally your voice, like the tone of your voice, your identity in a very fundamental way. So if we can keep our passports safe, can we not keep 24 words safe? And we can generate them however we like. We don't have to go to a centralized issuing authority. We have the right and the ability to generate them under any circumstances and keep them safe in any way that we think is appropriate. And so I guess this speaks a little bit to your question of data sovereignty. What does it really mean? Well, if we think about like the legacy of people's lives, is it not that most of the times the things that they say are worth more than the money that they accumulate? Like, is it not that the impact that most people leave on the world has more to do with the things that they decide to do with their time? And if you do stuff in cyberspace, you also do it with keys, or the things that they discuss, the way that they interact with the world. I guess in cyberspace, that is all under the realm of data sovereignty. Having your own keys, and don't get me wrong, I think that like a one of the things that is enabled by crypto is a sound financial system, which the world needs. Perhaps it's one of the most important things we need in this crazy age. But I also think that data sovereignty is way under discussed because the financial incentives are way more on this focus around money and other finance system. Makes sense. But I think long term, 20 years from now, when we look at cyberspace, it will be defined by cryptographic keys and access to services that render inalienable rights to people in the same way that states give you theoretically inalienable rights. Except the thing is, you can trust math an awful lot more than you can trust a politician. Right. Anyway.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I was just reflecting on what you were saying there, that many of the rights that we have, like politically in the West, with regards to things like finance, are and blockchains and cryptography, are actually all protected under another right, which is speech. So in a weird way, there is this sort of like, hey, financial sovereignty is so great. It has, it has this economic upside, but actually the thing that's really enabling it is speech, the right to speech, which is a very sort of interesting, almost like a Ouroboros there. Mike, what do you think? Is it a privilege and an honor to hold keys? Is this something that we should continue to onboard users to, or is it something that's really just for advanced users?
I think it's going to be mostly for advanced users because, yeah, for the most part, people just want simplicity, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, it's very good to have rights over your own assets, but that responsibility is, I think, far too much for most people. Yeah, like you look at the average person today, they don't even, most people don't even use a computer anymore. They just use a smartphone. Most people rather pay like, what is it, like $5 or $7 US per month to have all their stuff stored in some centralized server owned by Apple or Google, whatever it might be. And that's the way most people tend to work nowadays. As long as they can retrieve their photos and families and also not get hacked. I think people are willing to, yeah, I mean, like, yes, like, NSA, CIA, whatever three-letter agency can, like, swoop in and to probably take a look at everything that they want to. But I think most people don't feel like they're valuable enough to really care. They feel like they have nothing to hide anyways. So I think my point is, whatever it might be, digital assets, whether it's a token or pictures or data, most people are not really at the stage where they're able to handle self-sovereignty. It requires a lot of technical expertise. So I think there's a lot of that's also a good part of all this is we're still so early. We're early, and there's a lot of benefits to be had for people and the parties that actually have the self-sovereignty technology done in such a way that allow the end user to really hold their own keys without knowing too many technical matters. I think that's what they're trying to solve. At least in Bitcoin with some of the newer technology, like what's that guy's name? I forgot that guy's name, but he's got this whole system where the keys are like held between many parties, many multi-sigs, kind of like a giant private key held by like a community of people, and if a certain number of them disappear, it doesn't matter, it'll still work. I think those are interesting concepts. But yeah, like cryptography and all this blockchain technology is still at a time and place where it's just far too difficult for the average person. I think Bobby Lee came out yesterday with his Valley wallet, and I think he said it right. Complexity is the biggest enemy of all this technology, all this crypto technology, cryptography. It is not actually attackers or hackers trying to come in and get your keys or get your passphrases. It's actually like people losing their own keys, losing their passphrases. That is the most worrisome, the most troublesome. So simplicity also is a winner in this sense. The more simple you make the private key to be held by the person, the easier it is. Yeah, the less likely that they will lose their assets. And I think people want that. But I think for most people, which like probably 90% of people, they're happy just using Binance, right? They're happy just using Coinbase, whatever that might be.
I would inject there. You're absolutely right in the description of, like, I guess, the ease of use and the convenience that the world's become accustomed to. I guess I'll ask this question hypothetically to the audience: should it be that way? Should people give up their rights for convenience? Is that the world that we want to live in? Do we want to sort of try to turn cryptography into that as well? I don't think that's what you're saying. So, but it's an interesting question. When we look forward to the future of cryptography, I wonder how much, if you're middle-aged like me, there was one thing like my parents and their generation could never do. A friend of mine gave me this example recently, as they could never program the clock on a VCR. Like, as kids, if you even remember what a VCR is, basically, technology moved faster than the generation did. And then at some point, the next generation could just do it instinctively. And the previous generation just never really made the jump. And so, another hypothetical I wonder is, like, I wonder if that actually is the way with self-sovereignty, with keys, that it's the VCR, clock of this generation.
Just D-Mac, just real quick, my brain went exactly there too. I just spent the other day, I talked to my grandma, she's 83, and I was trying to convince her, not even just to use ChatGPT, but to do Google search. And she was convincing me that, she prefers looking things up in the encyclopedia because you lose something, when you do it on search. So some of these are generational behaviors, and I find it for that reason hard to speculate on the future usability or will people do XYZ, because we've learned to navigate this world in complex ways. We've learned to walk and then speak English and maybe other languages, and then we've learned to, like, open a checking account or bank and all these things. And so none of these things are, in a discrete sense, hard. They're just things to learn, and we've learned like a million things to get to where we are now. And can we learn this one thing, especially if it's made easier through technology? I think it's fairly likely, if it's important, that then people will learn it if they feel the downside of not learning it.
Yes, to
Go ahead,
jump
Sam.
in there. It's funny, I also thought of my grandmother, except it's actually trying to teach my grandmother to use a mouse. She never made it to being able to use a mouse, which is, quite sad in a way. But yes, it's definitely this question of, potentially ages, right? I could see that the next generation, of which a large number already own crypto, will probably be sufficiently interested to say, okay, I understand. All right, this is kind of like the passport, except it's a little book that I can keep. It's got my words in it. Not really all that complicated. But what also struck me in the slightly prior part of the conversation was, maybe this is just a case of, what rights are preserved when you use the technologies in these different ways. So if you use Bitcoin on the base layer, you have a key, it has some tokens inside. Maybe the key is even kept in your head if you desire, right? That's true self-sovereignty and censorship resistance. Those tokens are going with you wherever you go and nowhere else, unless you desire them to. So that's pretty profound. But even if you keep your Bitcoin on Binance, which please don't, by the way, but if you were to do so, you do kind of inherit certain properties from the protocol, even though you're using it in this sort of reduced way. And those would be, there is the threat of withdrawal, right? So Binance might rehypothecate your Bitcoin, as FTX did. It turns out they had no Bitcoin, if I remember correctly, or like one Bitcoin or something ridiculous, when people thought that they owned their Bitcoin on FTX. They might rehypothecate it, but you can extract your money, and there's a threat of that. And so that's something that keeps the third party in check. And so you get a limited exposure to the scarcity of Bitcoin, even if you hold it on a centralized exchange, which again, please don't. But so what I'm thinking is like the rights kind of trickle down, and there's a spectrum between these two extremes of like real self-sovereignty, where you have full rights that are granted by the protocol, and some sort of reduced set of rights if you decide to give away some of those for convenience. What comes to mind in the Arweave ecosystem is a system called keys aren't simple. So when you use a PermaWeb app, you use keys to sign the things that you say. So it's a decentralized social media system. You sign with your keys. Well, keys aren't simple is a way that you can basically, there's a little bit more complexity to it, but store your key one way or another in association with your Google account. Now, the runner of the website, so DMAC, you created a decentralized Twitter-like system on top of Arweave. DMAC has no way to sign transactions from your address, right? So you have some level of increased rights in that regard. But ultimately, Google still has access to steal your key if they so desired in this setup. And so that's the non-financial equivalent of this limited sovereignty, where you're trading away some of it for increased usability. And I would hope that people move more in the direction of real sovereignty over time, but we can kind of stomach some midpoints if necessary in the intervening period, I think.
That's very interesting. There's a forcing function right now, I think, around data sovereignty that's pushing it more into the public eye and to the forefront. And that's this idea of generative content, both the back end and the front end of AI, right? So there's the training of data sets, and then there's also the content that's produced by these large models. And neither of them is making anyone, well, I would say it's very divided, right? On one hand, there's like incredible power that's been unlocked and the ability to generate content, but then a lot of content creators are seeing that like their content's being, derivative works are being made, or actually, full on counterfeit versions of their content, like their voice and their likeness and stuff are used to create content that isn't actually from them. And so the idea of these rights, things like speech, things like ownership and control and influence over your data are becoming more and more central to society as a whole. So Tom, I'm going to jump on you a little bit and say, like, what in terms of data sovereignty, what do you see the impacts of data sovereignty on AI and vice versa?
So and again, yesterday I was talking about the ability to put your data out there and sign it and license it in a way that you control how it's being used. So from the back end, if AI is scraping your data, being able to control that and say, hey, pay me a royalty if you want to use my data, or you're not allowed to use my data at all. And I signed that with my key, and I can, basically interact with those systems to, basically get something for providing value, or maybe not even providing the value at all. And if an AI tries to use my content, then I have a enforceable right using like the universal data license to pursue them. From the front end, I think again, it becomes a big challenge, but being able to represent yourself as an identity and being able to verify and not trust that this information is coming from a source of value is really kind of the best way that I can describe it. But it's really interesting how AI is just being kind of affecting every conversation, and just the unknown of unknown with AI, where it goes every day. So I think knowing that DMAC sent me a letter is going to be more and more important in the front end, to be able to verify and not trust that just because I got an email from DMAC at dmac.com, I don't know, was that AI generated? Was that coming from an untrusted source? So I think, again, I kind of think that keys and the ability to verify information is just going to become more and more important over time.
Sam, I know Ford's been doing a bunch of work in this area, and there's some interesting projects being incubated there. What are your thoughts on the impacts of data sovereignty and AI on one another?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is this initiative we have called Rail, which is essentially a mechanism that AI. There's no set term for these companies yet, but basically AI producers, so people that provide hosted models that produce outputs for end users to use. Yes, they can implement this, and they can essentially create attestations that say, hey, this output, I created it at this time for this user, and it's cryptographically signed, of course, and sent to the network, which is an open public data space. And other companies can also do this. And so we're trying to work with as many of the major AI producers as we can, so that the public can then, when they see an image associated with a news article, they can check, hey, was this actually created by AI or is it real? And that we hope could defang some of the larger problems with this generative AI boom, which is essentially like, how do we know what's real anymore? Yeah, that's the first one that comes to mind. But it just occurred to me that, like, you could say the crux of all of this is basically like cryptography, or it didn't happen, right? So if the output is not signed, then it reminds me of interestingly, this big focus in the crypto industry on content identifiers, which was popularized by a distributed hash table service that shall not be named. But they have this idea that, okay, if you have a piece of content, you should just be able to find it by using its hash. Well, okay, that's fine. But like, ultimately, this is a step back from the web. The web already is, because if I go to news website ilike.com, let's say Wall Street Journal, because it's not that. Most people find the Wall Street Journal to be relatively trustworthy. If I go to WSJ.com and I look at an article, I can see in the URL bar, it's got a big padlock. It says, okay, this was sent to me. This was signed by the certificate associated with the Wall Street Journal. If I go to a content identifier, I don't know who it was uploaded by. It could be anyone. And it's essentially worthless. Without knowing where the data came from, without the provenance, it's almost useless in most cases, unless it's entertainment. That's really the one thing where maybe it's still useful to people. But outside of entertainment, it's hard to think of data that without associated provenance information is valuable to us. Yeah, so again, it speaks to your point. Cryptography and keys are fundamentally the thing that will enable in a number of different vectors simultaneously us to move into this new world that we're inhabiting with good rights, without being lost and confused, and without being sort of subsumed into this what do you say, into the big tech nightmare that appears to be looming. Yeah. Let's say that.
It's interesting that censorship resistance as an attribute of sovereignty has been with us from the beginning. Like, that was a big point of Bitcoin, is the inability to censor financial transactions. And indeed, like, even recording history has been part of Bitcoin since the beginning, when Satoshi put like Chancellor on the brink of second bailout for banks. That concept of provenance, like being able to record history or record speech into a blockchain, has been with us from the very beginning. And what we're starting to see now is that provenance is something that is just as important and just as impactful. Well, maybe we're not quite there yet as censorship resistance, but it's becoming another very strong component or attribute of sovereignty as a whole. Is provenance is now part of that thing. And it's interesting that it's been implicit in decentralized blockchains since the very beginning. And so, one of the advantages of Arweave is its ability to scale on-chain data. So, you have in your Coinbase transaction, you have sort of a limited amount of space, a couple hundred bytes to store provenance information. On Arweave, you can store that at any scale. And today it's happening at 150 transactions per second. And to Sam's point, these about the location of this information, storing important information, attributes like provenance about the data, that's happening on chain on Arweave. So we're wrapping up on time here. We're actually a little bit over. I'd like to just go around the guests and say any final comments, anything you'd like to add before we wrap up. Go ahead, Aki.
Yeah, we won't have time to spend more time on this, but I just to, I guess, qualify my background a bit, I became an AI VC in 2011, and 10 years ago, I invented a way to optimize content for search using machine learning. And then 6 years ago, we built an LLM prior to, I think, GPT-3, and had a whole research center in Montreal. So spent a lot of time there. I think we should do another panel on that. I don't know if it'll be in the confines of this conference, but we should do that because I think of generative AI both as a tool and potentially as an entity, kind of how like corporations are people too. They're not, but it could be its own entity, but it definitely is a tool that people can use in positive or malevolent ways. But anyway, just to kind of bring it back to sovereignty, crypto is definitely, or Web3 is definitely the confluence of a lot of things that are on people's minds. And I just think about the value of privacy and the value of, censorship resistance. And, that is really felt when you feel the opposite of it, as people do in Argentina for different reasons, so on. So that's really what it's going to take to get broad adoption, is for people to feel censored, and when they do, for there to be an available technological option that is easy enough for them to access, maybe on an iPhone or something that they're familiar with. But anyway, I'll stop talking because I know we're over time and would love to do another panel on this AI stuff.
Thanks, Aki. Mike, final thoughts?
Yeah, I think it will take a lot of time for all this stuff to play out. I think, to be honest, like crypto has only been in the mainstream, I think probably like since the previous bull market, 2017. Before that, it was still kind of obscure. So like actually like in the public side point of view, most people only came to crypto maybe like since 2017 or after. So we're still very, very early, just like everything else. Like look at how long the internet took from the early Web 1 to a point where majority of people have used the internet in some capacity. So I think we're still very far away, and usability is a big quick question, and there still needs to be more modifications for just regular people, grandmas, to get into this space and have to make it more useful to them. So we're not quite there yet, and yeah, just kind of I think crypto is still waiting for its like ChatGPT moment. If I were to be honest, yeah, it's still very speculative at this point in time. So it'll take some years, I think. Yeah, that's my final comment. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Tom, anything to add?
DMAC, thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's been a pleasure. And again, just super excited about where the Bitcoin and the Arweave community is going in terms of this. And, the last comment is just, I always believe it's a privilege to have these tools, because when I started in Web 1, being a developer, I had these tools, and then in Web 2, they kind of gotten taken away. So it's just always, for me, I'll always think of this as a privilege to have the Arweaves and the Bitcoins in the world as options. It may not satisfy everybody, but if it's not there, I don't want to think about what things would be like. So thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Happy to have you. Thank you for coming. Sam, why don't you take us out?
Thanks. Yeah, just I guess I'd like to reiterate what Tom said. I mean, watching the exodus of people from crypto to AI over the last year or so has been kind of curious, because in my mind, they are essentially dipoles of the same spectrum. One is going to increase centralized power extremely quickly, and the other is essentially the bulwark, which says, no, we should increase personal freedom in a world where the power and effect of technology is rapidly increasing. So if you're the owner of that technology, you get more and more power. And I really feel like, yeah, I was born at a time where I could, in some sense, watch. I grew up with the free internet and watched it kind of die. And I feel very, very, very grateful that we really, as a result of peer-to-peer technologies, but blockchain specifically, have like at least something that if we get it right, we can bring back a free internet and stop the door closing completely. Because I just like to reiterate what Tom says, I don't want to know what the world looks like if we don't, frankly. So yeah, thank you for hosting the panel, DMAC. I think that was actually a very interesting discussion. My takeaway is like, this all comes from keys. Sovereignty doesn't work in cryptography without keys. That's actually a pretty interesting thought I hadn't spent too much time thinking about. But yeah, grateful for the opportunity to discuss it and explore.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much to all the panelists for attending and answering these questions. Like Sam says, I found the conversation to be fascinating. And yeah, it is one of the truly exciting things about the space is that decentralization and blockchains are one of the few bright spots in technology that have sort of an obvious optimistic upside. There isn't sort of a shadow version of decentralization and self-sovereignty that threatens the other sort of utopian version of it. And so that's one of truly exciting things about working in this space. Both Bitcoin and Arweave have obvious, pro-social, empowering properties for individuals, and as a result, for the future that we want to build. So thank you so much for your attendance, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, DMAC. Thank you, Sam, Aki, Tom, and Albert. Yeah, thank you for all. And we will the events online will be in. So thank you for all. And